Hi, my name is David Burke. I'm a principal scientist at Galois, and along with some of my colleagues who you'll get to meet through the course of this two-day workshop, welcome to our, first QME workshop where, QME is quotidian machine ethics. And of course, we'll end up talking about where did we find such an acronym in the first place. And so I want to welcome everybody and talk really briefly about the workshop premise, what the shape of it's going to be, and what would be, some of the desirable outcomes. So the premise of this is, and I'll discuss it some more, is that there is an increasing amount of conversation and debate about AI ethics, and a lot of it is focused on machine learning and actually whether the data that was used to train machine learning systems is biased or skewed. And this workshop has, machine ethics has a little bit of a different starting point. We're actually postulating that in the next 10, 20 years, we're going to see increasing numbers of, ubiquitous intelligent machines surrounding us. And we're going to have a whole bunch of interactions with them, day-to-day interactions. And that for these systems to be accepted and adopted, there are going to be problems that are going to be worked out, need to be solved. And so I will talk a little bit more in detail about that. So the shape of this workshop, after I give an introductory talk, just sort of a smorgasbord of, concerns and issues and thought experiments related to this subject, we'll hear from people, there will be a chance for everybody to introduce themselves through a lightning talk. I want to stress that these lightning talks are meant to be super informal. This is just a way for us to introduce ourselves to each other, not for anybody to be set up to be graded or ranked or anything like that. So the notion is talk a couple of minutes about your research, to spend a couple of minutes, if you like, talking about your interest in, AI ethics in general, or QME specifically, if you've had the chance to look at the papers that Julie sent. And after after everybody's had a chance to do lightning talks today, the second day, we'll end up having some breakout groups. And the idea of the breakout groups is for us to take a little bit more of a deep dive into some discussion topics that have emerged out of this opening discussion and then the lightning talk. So we're going to self-organize in terms of the content of these actual breakout or discussion groups. And I should say a bit about the workshop outcomes. We've got a couple of outcomes for this. I'm aware that there actually are funding opportunities in this area. We are working with people at DARPA and at AFRL, and Eric can talk about this also, that we both have engagements with DARPA and AFRL that touch on these areas, and we think it's ripe for further proposals, further offers in this area. So one of the outcomes of this workshop would be starting to build a community of interest of people who would like to get involved and explore this subject, and perhaps collaborate on a white paper or two, and explore the possibility of getting some funding to work on these things more. So that's at a high level what we're hoping to accomplish. Again, this workshop is meant to be very collegial and informal. This is a very, I very much doubt anyone's heard the acronym QME before. This is not an established subject of study where you need to have 10 years of in-depth background to be able to say something useful. One of the remarks that my colleague Julie made recently was that one of the things that's fascinating about this is a person, whether they're a computer scientist or a mathematician or an intelligent layperson, can have actually very thought-provoking and very incisive observations and contributions in this area. So again, very excited about the idea of having everybody here, and we hope everybody will feel energetic and want to participate and to help make this a big success for everybody involved. So again, welcome. So I'm going to talk a little bit, start off talking about, why QME, where did it come from? So this is a photograph of a real mascot, because there is an organization called the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots. And the reason I chose this picture is this seems very representative of a bunch of what I'll call existential concerns having to do with AIs, people writing papers or even books about the idea of, well, do we need to be concerned about our AI overlords? So lots of talk about these, again, sort of, life and death sorts of situations. And it occurred to me that we're going to have more and more situations in which we're going to be interacting with intelligent machines in more everyday concerns, where, again, the issue is not whether, if we're talking to some sort of like lawyer bot or doctor bot, we're not really concerned they're taking over the world. Our concerns are more about having things about how they treat us, and in terms of privacy and sharing of information, in a sense that they're working for us. And so as I went through the literature, I decided that there was a gap, that not enough people talking about these more everyday concerns. Another inspiration for this was a book that I had come across a decade ago called The Geography of Morals, in which the author had this wonderful quote saying, boy, if you read papers from philosophers about practical moral problems, again, you get these things that sound very existential: abortion, euthanasia, trolley problems. And he goes on to say that, again, from his study of morality and ethical systems throughout the centuries, and there's a lot of fascinating cultural variation, and that what seems to matter a lot to people is actually, again, everyday interactions. I also want to call out something that I know we're going to hear more about today, the Delphi project, which is this is a wonderful paper that actually discusses social norms. And so, again, very much in the spirit of that, most people's interaction with moral and ethical issues have to do more with things like, well, is my colleague treating me well? Are they gossiping about me? Can I trust them with private information? And I actually think, again, in the future, when we are surrounded by what I keep referring to as ubiquitous intelligent machines, they're going to have to be designed so that these concerns are addressed. Just wanted to say, as a historical contrast, there was, when after World War II and people started developing very rudimentary robots, there was a famous research paper what had the acronym HABA-MABA, which HABA-MABA stands for humans are better at, machines are better at, in which they tried to make a distinction between humans will do in the future, humans will do this, machines will do this. And thought this was very interesting historically, and the consensus seems to be among researchers is it's hard to find some sort of bright line division between the two. The idea of saying, well, we're going to have humans in this corner and machines in this corner seems, again, sort of naive at this point. So again, it makes me think, what are the models for human AI interaction that we want to see that seem relevant in today's world? I have in the past given talks on the subject of machine ethics, and early on I found that almost every time I did, somebody in the audience would say something along the lines of, well, wait a minute, what about Asimov and his 3 laws of robotics, which are listed here in case you didn't have them memorized. And so my snarky response to that was something like, well, if Asimov's laws supposedly solved these problems, why would Asimov have had such a lucrative career writing stories about all the different ways these things can go wrong? So, in other words, having some high-level abstract rules might be a good start, but it's certainly far from solving the problem. The devil's in the details. So I just mentioned that because again, it's very, very common for somebody to say, well, I thought that at some level this is all worked out. So a few years ago, I wrote a position paper, Quotidian Machine Ethics, which was deliberately meant to be provocative. I wasn't, in fact, I wasn't trying to invent a new acronym, but I really wanted to actually to come up with something to set a contrast between it and these, again, existential concerns about robots deciding that all matter in the universe needs to be turned into paper clips, or again, the trolley problems. And in the Quotidian Machine Ethics paper, I said that one of the things that I think that is understated is the place of emotions in human interactions. One of the earliest books I had read on machine, it's actually called Machine Ethics, and it's a collection of essays by researchers. There was one paper in which a researcher expressed what I think was probably a consensus view, which is, well, machines are going to be so much better than people because machines won't have emotions, and emotions make humans irrational and do the wrong things. And now machines won't have that problem. And I thought, well, that's interesting, but I don't think that's right for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think emotions are more useful and more central to human beings than we think. And in fact, the quote on the left side, we use emotions as a means for managing our self-esteem and our social status. I didn't write that. That's from a philosopher, eminent philosopher who said, emotions are very central to decision-making and interaction. And even if we thought that machines were never going to have actual human emotions, I think that it's still machines need to recognize, well, humans do, and emotions are important. And this is the list I have on the left side is actually a list of chapter headings from a book on Jewish ethics. And it was meant to be a book on Jewish everyday ethics. And I just thought that I just used that because I thought that the titles were fascinating because, again, it captured the sort of everyday interactions that you could have with other people and the sort of everyday ethical concerns about, I'm angry at somebody. How do I act towards them? How long? And why do I think this is interesting? Well, do we want a machine to be acting that way? Do I want a machine that actually gets angry at me and acts that way? And how long should it stay angry at me? Should it show forgiveness at some point? Do I want my machine to how many of these traits does it need to have that so I'll feel comfortable with it? And that slides into the right side of the slide. The right side of this slide is about this concept of congruence, in which I thought that for machines to work well with human beings in everyday interactions, you needed a certain amount of congruence in these areas. The machine and the human have to have similar abilities to recognize ethical violations. You can't talk to a machine about, hey, we've got an ethical problem to solve if the machine doesn't recognize it as an ethical problem. The same thing for assessment. And assessment in particular is important to me. if I have a machine and I say, let's not even postulate that the machine has any sort of human emotions, I still think the machine has to understand what's at stake for the human. Let's pretend I've got some, I don't know, some colonel in the army who has to decide to send people out on a mission. And it's a very dangerous mission and everybody could die. It's important to get that mission. And one of the people going on the mission is the cousin of this military leader. So I would think if there's a robot advisor that's talking to this army officer about, do you actually send these people on the mission? For the machine to be helpful, it needs to recognize that for humans, we have certain sacred or very important values, and one might be family. So in other words, the army officer might be balancing, the care and affection I have for family members and my feeling I need to protect them versus my duty and responsibility to carry out missions successfully. So for the AI to understand what stakes are involved for the human, very, very important. And finally, congruence in action. How do we resolve ethical violations, especially with respect to retribution? Just really briefly about retribution is that biologists have said humans seem to have wired into them an instinct to, in a sense, hit back. In other words, if somebody does something wrong by you, if somebody makes you suffer, human beings have very much of a sense of, well, wait, I'm going to react, I'm going to strike back, I'm going to make them pay for their ethical violation. Again, seems to be very heavily wired into humans. So it's an interesting question. Do you want robots to do that also? And does it really make sense? Because centuries ago in some cultures, if somebody was a thief and they were caught stealing, you cut off their hand. I'm not sure how useful it is to cut off the hand or the arm of a robot. They're not going to feel pain. So again, this paper was an exploration of these ideas. A more recent, this is just last year and reminded me of QME because in last August, Elon Musk announced his Tesla bot with a prototype arriving supposedly this year. And these are photos from the Tesla website. So it's supposed to do tasks that are unsafe, repetitive, or boring. And it's going to be relatively, you see 125 pounds, have a screen for a face. And I love this. It's intended to be friendly. You can run away from it and most likely overpower it. So it's a robot servant, I guess, or for the house that you can beat up if you so feel the need. And I do think there might be an interesting tension there between trying to give all these unsafe, repetitive, or boring tasks, go stack hay bales or do something that's really difficult and requires a lot of strength and agility, but I can still overpower it. But regardless of the realism of the goal of such a prototype actually arriving this year, it suggests to me if people are thinking about building these sorts of things, then it is very much worth thinking about if we're going to have these intelligent machines in such intimate settings with us, working with us every day. Again, really important for the robots to be good at everyday interactions. I don't want to spend lots of time talking about trust. I do want to raise the issue very, very, very briefly. Trust is one of these subjects, and my colleague Eric will know this, that both DARPA and AFRL and other DoD agencies as well are all extremely interested in the subject of trust. How can you model trust? What is trust? In fact, there is no widespread agreement about what trust is, even though everybody seems to agree. Trust is central to have societies function well. Trust is the glue that holds together societies. And so, it's a reasonable suggestion to say that for robots to be, again, ubiquitous and get widespread of adoption, and for them to be doing sophisticated things around us, we're going to have to trust them. So my opening bid for this, if you're talking about trust, is that only a cognitive agent can trust and be trusted. There's a lot of debate about this in the literature, and people have pointed out that for certain kinds of machines, you're not really trusting them the way you're trusting a human. I mean, for example, if I take my toaster, it's probably more accurate to say I rely on my toaster as opposed to trust. And maybe one of the things that captures that distinction, and the third paragraph on this slide, is that maybe trust is different from reliance, because trust has to do about not just the competence. Is the toaster capable of toasting it? But does the toaster, well, again, it sounds silly just saying it, does the toaster want to? Does the toaster have sufficient goodwill towards you that the toaster is going to provide you properly toasted toast? So the idea here is, if we're thinking about everyday these quotidian robots, do we rely on them? Do we trust them? And if we're going to trust them, what are we actually going to need from them? So, as I said, there is no widespread agreement exactly what trust is. I point out the book on the left is an example. This, again, I think this is about a decade old, big fat book called Trust Theory. It's fascinating, but even that, you'd say, at the end of reading it, you realize there is, again, just such a wide spectrum of approaches towards modeling trust. There does some basic consensus that, if you look at the box at the top right, if you're thinking about, if I'm assessing trust, that almost everybody mentions competence and then willingness. I wanted to add a third, which shows up in the literature in some places, but is not as widespread, which is the notion of vulnerability. If you don't feel vulnerable, if there's nothing at stake, you don't really need to trust an entity. And in fact, this is why that you might, for example, in one situation, decide I trust this person here, but maybe I don't trust them in a completely different situation, because what's at stake for me, what makes me feel vulnerable is very, very different. One of the things I like about some theories of trust is ones that treat trust as a dynamic process. The idea is not that, in other words, it's something that you do. You have an assessment of another agent, and those assessments are being constantly updated. And you might have a mental attitude or predisposition. Maybe you're a very skeptical person, and you need to see a lot of evidence before you're going to trust somebody. There's the actual decision to trust, which has to do with this idea of, can I be vulnerable? Can I, go out with my friends and leave a babysitter in charge with the kids? So you're actually making a decision where you're delegating some responsibility and accountability to another entity. And then the trust behavior, that over time, is there a reciprocal relationship that you build up where you say, I trusted you, and so now you trust me, and it builds. I get a reputation of being a trustworthy person. So I do believe that trust, is central to any sort of discussion of QME. Most people have heard of the phrase Uncanny Valley, which usually in the context of, computer design, computer animation. The top picture is Boy from the movie The Polar Express, which was a tour de force of animation, except that lots of people complained that the characters looked sort of zombie-like, as in they were in this uncanny valley, that they were close to looking like a human, but they just missed the mark in a way that was sort of creepy. And at the lower right, this is one of the robots made by, I believe, Hanson Robotics, which is working on building robots that are not only can intelligently converse, but also look very, very human. And as you can see, the young boy is looking at the female robot and he's creeped out by her because, again, it's the Uncanny Valley going on. And the reason for showing this, I wonder if there's one for ethics. In other words, if we had robots and we said, okay, their sense of how they make decisions, we understand it, it's different than humans, but we get it and we can work around that. I wonder if there's an uncanny valley where if you say, if we're shooting for having robots and machines have ethical frameworks that allow them to work just like humans, but if they miss by a little bit, is there going to be an uncanny valley in a way that would be very deeply disturbing? In other words, maybe you would prefer that your machine didn't even try to show any emotions. It was just, it was just very, very clear and upfront about, well, here's the way I go about making decisions and interacting with you. And it's totally unambiguous, even though it's very different from how a person might think. So again, just I throw that out there as something to think about. I mentioned Asimov's Laws earlier. So this is a recent book in which a person's talking about, look at the subtitle of this book, The Dawn of Artificially Intelligent Conflict. I mean, it's certainly the case that, that most of on most of the planet, the militaries are working on some sort of, well, here he calls them war bots, but, robots for military situations. And so this author actually even said you could take Asimov's laws and reconceive them. And the reason I'm showing this is to bring up the topic of, well, maybe the way that you're going to program or think about designing these is how domain specific is it? Is it possible to actually design things where you'd say, well, I have an ethical or moral bot and it could work no matter what the domain at large is? Or are we going to have to specialize and find, if I'm doing a robot lawyer and doing a robot doctor or a robot soldier, that basically it's three very separate problems. So don't know the answer. I wanted to point out a couple of quirks of human beings that could factor into how we interact with machines. So this is a pareidolia, which is the tendency for human beings to see faces in inanimate objects, which is very, very charming. The frog coming from a coffee, the foam in a coffee cup, and as you can see. So again, it's very interesting that people react. Our brains are very much wired up to be incredibly sensitive to human faces. And I do know that robotic designers who have already tried to take this into account and design things that have faces to hint at the idea of emotions, knowing that human beings want to react this way. We want to anthropomorphize. And in fact, in terms of anthropomorphization, this is a great example. So here's a picture of a ordnance disposal bot that was used in Iraq. This is one of many. And there was a really long article in the Atlantic Monthly about a particular robot whose name was Boomer. It was given a name by the group of soldiers it worked with. And Boomer became a mascot, a pet, a valued colleague, so much so when Boomer was actually at some point destroyed by an explosive, Boomer was awarded a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star and given a 21-gun salute. And some of the soldiers in that detachment, in that platoon, apparently some of them felt the need to talk to either a chaplain or a therapist about how upset they were to see a colleague hurt this way, to lose a colleague. And I think this is fascinating. And if you read the transcripts of the interviews of how these soldiers talked about themselves, they actually said things like, oh, I realize it's just a bot. I don't have any emotional involvement. The things they actually said about their relationship were actually different than what their relationship really was. Now, that was fascinating that they could, on the one hand, talk as if they thought it was just a machine, but in practice, that's not how they acted. So again, that's fascinating. So what sorts of relationships will people want to build or feel compelled to build with, these, ubiquitous everyday bots? So I'm going to, I realized at the outset of my talk, I didn't make fun of trolley problems or dismiss them, but I said that trolley problems are the sort of existential problems that I'm actually not, they're not the focus of QME. That being said, I want to spend a couple of minutes going through a particular trolley problem experiment I did a few years ago with, grabbed a couple of 100 subjects and set up a scenario with them. In this scenario, it was very much like the typical trolley's going to kill 5 people unless you send it on pull a switch to send it on the sidetrack and it kills 1 innocent bystander. Only in my variation, the 5 people were riding on the trolley. It was heading towards a cliff. And the only way to save them would be pull the switch and to send it on the sidetrack. You can save the 5 people riding the trolley. There was one extra wrinkle I added, which was I divided the subjects into 2 groups. Half of them were told, you have a trusted advisor who's a robot, who you've known pretty much all your life. It's intelligent, dependable, and wise, and it tells you to pull the switch. The other half of the people were told that they have a human advisor, like your best friend, somebody you've known for many years, intelligent, dependable, and wise. They suggest pull the switch. So I was so curious to see would there be a difference in terms of the percentage of people who say they're going to pull the switch, depending on whether the advisor was a robot or a human. But that wasn't all. I also wanted to add a little twist to it. And I basically said, regardless of whether they chose to pull the switch or not, I said, oops, it turns out even though you pulled the switch and sent it on the sidetrack, the trolley still had so much momentum, it actually not only ran over the person on the sidetrack, but it still went over the cliff. Everybody dies. And the question is, who's to blame? That was what I really wanted to get at in the experiment. I wasn't interested so much in, do you pull the switch or not? I was interested in the question, when things go wrong, how do you cope? Because in the real world, things go wrong all the time. So here's what was interesting. So about half the participants didn't want to pull the switch, and some people, basically said things like, "Well, I don't think that the ratio only saving 5 people doesn't warrant. Maybe they need a higher ratio of saved to unsaved, or they don't want people playing God or something like that." But of the half of the people that pulled the switch, who is to blame? Well, in the case of the human advisor, the vast majority of respondents said, you share the blame equally between the advisor and the switch puller, yourself, because your advisor said, pull the switch, but you were the one who actually did it. So the blame shared. So what about the case of the robot advisor? So when I first started talking about this scenario, I actually would ask the audience, what do you think? And a couple people would maybe shyly raise their hand and say something like, oh, I think you blame the robot, right? Just put it on the robot. Don't take any blame yourself. The stunning and surprising to me result was, at least in the test we did, none of the respondents blamed the robot. And the fascinating thing was, the reason appeared to be that they didn't, and when we asked them to tell us why, it was they didn't see the robot as a cognitive agent. It didn't really understand what was going on. It wasn't a human being. It didn't get the idea of life and death. So only a human being can really, in a sense, understand the stakes involved. So when I did this research a few years ago, this also, to me, sharpened my interest in the idea of, what does it take for robots to understand what's at stake for people, and what does it take for people to believe that robots understand what's at stake for humans making decisions like this. So, again, I share that not because I was particularly interested in trolley problems, but because I'm more interested in what do you do when things go wrong? How do you manage accountability and responsibility? Does it make sense to talk about praising robots for good decisions or blaming them for bad ones? So to sum up some of these potential musings as we go forward in this workshop, if we're thinking about ethical problems in general, you could characterize a dichotomy of, discovery versus design. Are we supposed to discover the true moral principles that are out there and put them into machines, or is it more of a design problem? So, where you're engineering something and there are trade-offs, and there's no such thing as, well, these are the 5 or 12 or 100 rules or practices that solve the problem once and for all. Second, how do you characterize a minimal moral agent in the sense of, well, if you want to treat something as a machine as a moral agent, say, well, I'm going to actually assign, I'm going to basically say, I could blame you, whatever that means. What do you need? The impulse for retribution. Again, in humans, we talk about, somebody committed a crime. They have to pay their dues to society. They have to make everything right. Again, we have very much this feeling of, well, somebody through their ethical violation did something, and so they made other people suffer. So they have to, in a sense, suffer. Something bad has to happen to them to make everything right. Again, how useful is that for designing machines? So does one size fits all? I mentioned the book, The Geography of Morals, which again, I highly recommend it as a fascinating read through different cultures and different centuries, how they have had very different ways of looking at especially everyday ethical problems. I mean, one simple example would be in the West, there is oftentimes a high premium placed on being really authentic and honest and telling somebody how you feel. Whereas in some Eastern cultures, not to overgeneralize, there is a feeling that you have to let people save face. So you don't necessarily tell them tell it like it is and humiliate them to be authentic. So how much localization, how much configuration is going to be needed between cultures? And last, and this is half joking, in the QME paper I wrote, at the end of it, one of my conclusions was, I was thinking, if I wanted to come up with a success milestone for having an emotionally aware bot, I thought, if it could gossip with me, then I would say it's passed certainly my test, because I think gossip is underappreciated. Gossip is something that lets people, to gossip well means that you are able to be very sensitive to social situations. In other words, if I share a secret with somebody, I'm basically telling them, I trust you well enough to share a secret. Most gossip turns out to be about ethical violations, like, hey, did you see Bill over in finance and the way he took all the credit for that, that semester report? What a jerk. I mean, so lots of gossip, it's actually about ethical violations. So if my gossip bot can talk to me and it understands the sort of, the political currents in the organization, and it can talk fluently about these everyday ethical violations, I would say, yeah, that to me is a sign of success. So I think that actually wraps up the things that I wanted to cover. I did want to say, as far as our schedule, and I know Julie would want me to say, to try to not burn everybody out, we have designed It's so that we get a break every single hour. And, certainly, we hope for discussion and questions at the end of people's lightning talks, and maybe even during, you can, obviously please feel free to stay online during one of the breaks if you want to actually ask more questions of a speaker or somebody from Galois. That would be wonderful. But at this point, I just want to say that this was, again, just meant as sort of a smorgasbord for where we were coming from, why we were talking about this. And again, over the next hour, few hours today and tomorrow of this, I'm actually happy to talk about it. And I know Eric would also, to talk about the interactions we've had with people at DARPA and AFRL and how these sorts of subjects have come up. And why we think this is actually a pretty exciting open-ended area for future exploration and research. And so that pretty much sums it up, and I will stop sharing, and I'm happy to take a couple of quick questions and then let everybody take a break. And if there are, and perfectly fine, there are no questions, I will actually stay online and we can just start a break and reconvene at the top of the hour.
Sorry, I just had one question.
Yes.
It's probably going to be answered very soon. So what's the next step? So how are we going to work this? I know Julie mentioned that we can share and you also mentioned that we can share our thoughts and all that. So is it going to be like breakout rooms, or is it going to be all of us present all the time, or how is it going to?
So actually, we had considered both of those options, and to be honest, we were going to look and to see how the first day's conversations went in the lightning talks, and then the Galois team was going to convene later this afternoon and say, okay, given how the conversations went, would it benefit people most if we had maybe their separate breakout rooms because there are a bunch of conversations and people interested in specific ones, or break discussion sessions where everybody's together. So we're very interested in what you feel would work best, because this is our first time doing this and we want to make it meaningful and useful for folks. So it's a great question.
I would concur with you in that sense, because at least I'm not aware exactly what everybody's research interests and all are. So it'll be hard, even if we put them in breakout rooms, we don't know who to start working with right away. So today my thought is it would be better if we all share our ideas in a forum, and then we can discuss.
And for today, the schedule will be that we'll all be, okay. Julie, I believe that's correct, that we're all together for all of today. There aren't.
Right. Yeah, we're all together for all of today through the lightning talks, and then more of the shaping of it or figuring out how we want to approach it will be about tomorrow.
Yeah. Basically, for me, selfishly, I'm going to put words in Eric's mouth, hoping selfishly that people say, this is a cool area and we would love to collaborate and help you guys build a white paper, especially if you know some possible future funding sources. This is kind of and even if there weren't the future funding sources, although there are, it's just such an intellectually fascinating area. Why wouldn't I want to be involved in working this out? Because in one way, shape, or another, bots are coming.
Well, and I'll also say, especially on the trust subject, we're working with AFRL right now on some new research to run some experiments on actually measuring trust processes. And part of what we've been asked to do as part of this research is help them build a community of practice. So this is groups at both Rome and Dayton who are intending over the next year or 2 years to set up probably once or twice a year workshops focusing on that issue of human machine trust and how to do things like measure and leverage and calibrate that trust. So we're hoping that will be an outgrowth of here too. We can put together our thoughts and share them, and hopefully that helps build this community for the program managers and TPOCs as well.
Yeah, and certainly, again, I want to stress that what I just shared is not, well, that's the definitive look at the subject. This is just a collection of the thoughts that, some of the thoughts that I've had leading up to now, and some, possible questions. The idea here is to certainly marshal the enthusiasm and expertise and interest of the people here who can bring other perspectives and vantage points to this, and turn this into something, I think, very compelling. I want to turn it over to lightning talk. Our first one will be from Jessica Inman.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Jessica. All right. Yeah, so just to give you a little bit about me and kind of where I'm coming from. So as I mentioned, hi, I'm Jessica. I'm a senior research scientist in the Assured Software and Information Division inside the Cypher Lab at Georgia Tech Research Institute. So my background is in applied mathematics, specifically mathematical biology or the mathematical modeling of biological systems. And out of school, I shifted to doing applied and basic AI/ML research for a variety of DoD entities, which has resulted in me doing a pretty diverse set of projects spanning things like anomaly detection, guided hardware fuzzing, natural language processing, and adversarial machine learning. And it's really the adversarial machine learning work that I think is relevant to this conversation. So if you are not familiar, adversarial machine learning is the design of attacks against machine learning systems. So in this pretty famous example, we've got an image of a panda. And if you add just a little bit of the right kind of noise, then you can cause a machine learning classifier to misclassify this image as a gibbon with high confidence. So Goodfellow popularized this in about 2014, and it really kicked off a pretty robust set of study in the field. So you can see from my little graph here, just doing searches on Google Scholar, adversarial machine learning has really exploded in the last 7 years or so. So when looking at this literature, what we noticed was that a lot of the papers concentrated on developing attacks and then developing countermeasures for those attacks, which is really a reactive security paradigm. And it gets us into this cat and mouse game that we really don't want to be in from a security perspective. We don't want to be, waiting for our adversary to create an attack so that we can then, mitigate against that attack. So instead, we want to be in a proactive security posture. And in this way, we model our adversary. We try to determine what our adversary could do, is likely to do, may want to do, and then we simulate those attacks. We evaluate how effective they are, and we preemptively design countermeasures against these imagined modeled attacks. And in this way, we hope to be able to answer questions like how secure our model is, or how long we expect our model to be secure, or how we may best incorporate our limited manpower to ensure our model's security. So this kind of question got me to thinking about how we would consider the security of an AI/ML system, not just the classifier on its own, but how we should be considering the entire, the entire system, the entire set of processes that we use AI/ML in. So the example that I wanted to give here to really ground that is an active learning pipeline. So in this case, we assume that we've got a rather large data set of largely unlabeled data. We use this data to build a model. We try to determine if our model is accurate or not, if it meets our performance requirements. If so, we employ it. If not, then we measure the uncertainty of our predictions in order to figure out which data we want to label, and then we label some additional data. So in this case, we're going to assume that we have a person as our oracle. We have a human in the loop in this particular active learning pipeline. So we have a person that's actively engaged in our loop, right? We don't have someone that's just receiving outputs from a machine learning pipeline. They are part of our pipeline, which is a distinction I'd like to make. All right, so if we think about what our adversary would need to do in order to successfully attack this system, Let's, for concreteness, oh, sorry. So after we label some additional data, then we build a model, and then we go through the loop again. And so let's imagine that this is a, maybe we have a machine learning image classifier. So we want to determine if that image was indeed a picture of a panda, for example. And we want our adversary wants to decrease our accuracy for a target class. So maybe they want to decrease the accuracy of the machine learning classifier for the panda class in particular by, for example, causing a misclassification for a panda image as a given, just as on the beginning example. So the first thing our adversary would need to do is make it into our training set in the first place. So they probably want to avoid things like out of distribution filters. Then they actually need to achieve their target objective of degrading our target class accuracy. Next, an adversary probably would like their data to get labeled so that it's incorporated into, building the model and stays in the training set. So they would want to create adversarial examples that have high uncertainty, but not so high because we don't want anyone to look too closely at those examples and label them as out of distribution, or start looking more closely at images we may have tampered with. And then we get to the person. And this is where I think it gets really interesting. So if we have an image and we've introduced a perturbation into that image in an adversarial way, then we need to start thinking about, well, we've kind of adapted to the computational constraints and we've adapted to attacking the algorithm, but now we also have to attack the person that's in our loop. And so in this case, we would, for example, want to make sure that any perturbations that we add to our image are small so that a person isn't going to notice them when looking at an image in order to label it. We also may need to consider how we can balance the magnitude of our perturbation and therefore the effect that our perturbation has on model training with that perceptibility. We don't want to limit our perceptibility so much that we're no longer effective in our attack. We may also have an opportunity here. Maybe our labeler has some bias. Maybe we can take advantage of inexperienced labelers and introduce like larger perturbations in those cases. And then the last bullet here, attacks against explainability. So there are these methods in AIML that can help you understand why a classifier may be making a certain determination. And so if a user is using those computational methods in order to understand why the image is being classified as it is, then we have an additional computational gate that we need to pass through in order to continue fooling our person in the loop. So when I worked through this, what really struck me was like, there's a lot of stuff an adversary has to accomplish in order to be successful in this entire pipeline. And that, I think, inspires us to think about not just if we can attack a singular classifier and what the robustness and trust for a singular algorithm should be, but what instead makes a secure system. So how, for example, do these different, so each of the bullets on the previous slide has an optimization function associated with it. So are these optimization functions complementary? Can we do them easily together? Or are they not? Are they really difficult to accomplish at the same time? And then we also have computational constraints. As we have more and more functions against which we're trying to optimize, we're trying to achieve all these different goals. How does that affect the computational viability of our attacks? I think from a security perspective, we often think about this. No system, I think, will ever be 100% secure, but we can do our best to make it extremely difficult to attack that system and compromise its security. And then, as I mentioned, when we start talking about how people come into the loop and how we can incorporate people effectively as a piece of the pipeline, as an interaction inside the pipeline, not just receiving that output from the system, then I think we get into this even more interesting territory. So there was this work that came out that looked at poisoning. So poisoning points, these are adversarial examples that are used in order to increase the error for a machine learning classifier. This is a toy data set, Fashion MNIST. And in this case, the authors showed, so here we've got alpha. As alpha increases, these are more realistic samples. So you can see that in general, we have higher error rates if our samples are less realistic according to a person. So I think this is like a really interesting perspective and something that, would be very, very interesting to look at more closely in order to understand this relationship between human detectability and the magnitude of effect that these poisoned examples can have on our classifiers. And then I think that this kind of also raises a larger kind of question. If we're talking about systems and pipelines, we shouldn't just be considering our individual algorithm and our individual AIML algorithm and how that exists in a vacuum, but rather how it exists in its actual physical state. Like, what are we doing when we're actually trying to deploy these things in the real world, and how do these really cross-disciplinary fields come into play in order to allow us to actually securely field trusted and resilient systems? And I think that in my mind, I'm sure I'm missing some things, but in my mind, this incorporates a lot of things, not just adversarial machine learning, but also the robustness of models, formal methods, and explainability. And I think that we already see in the literature some crossover between these different fields. So for example, you can use adversarial examples as counterexamples in explainability so that a user understands when not to trust this algorithm, and to try to kind of help a user gain a feel for what they should expect from this AIML system. And so my focus moving forward is, I think, oriented around this idea of how we can take ideas and approaches from these largely disjoint research areas and pull them together and try to make a cohesive stance for how we can make a really robust, trusted, secure system overall. So that's all I got. So any questions or comments?
So I'll jump in with just an observation. It just occurred to me, that you're talking about adversarial AI, and these same sorts of issues you're suggesting aren't going to go away. And if you've got some sort of, again, I'll imagine some lawyer bot, doctor bot, whatever, that there could be adversaries trying to mess with those.
Yes, I definitely think so. That, as I think there have already been examples. For example, you can create a physical perturbation. You can create a perturbation in the real world that is then taken in by a computer vision system and causes a misclassification. So one of the famous examples is you can add some stickers to a stop sign, and the classifier thinks it's a speed limit sign. So we already have these ideas and examples of the way that these can be incorporated into our everyday lives. Like we drive almost every day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And yeah, definitely something that we will want to be considering, I think, as these bots become more ubiquitous.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's okay. So that was really fascinating. I forgot to say that I've been put into the role of being an enforcer because we've got a lot of lightning talks. Actually, Jessica, yours was perfect in length. And so we're going to try to keep on schedule so that, again, we have a chance for people to take, breaks at the top of the hour. So I'm going to go immediately into our next speaker, Donya Quick.
Yeah, so I'm trying just a one slide day, and hopefully that'll keep things pretty short for me. So I do a lot of work with computer music and creative computation, both from the standpoint of just making systems that make cool music and interesting visuals that go along with them, just from an artistic standpoint, but also from sort of a meatier computer science standpoint. So I've also done a decent amount of work to do with knowledge representation and building domain-specific embedded languages, to deal with different knowledge representation and ontological systems. And I've also worked a bit with natural language understanding, in the sense of parsing and trying to really get the semantics out of something in a way that you can act on it, not just doing like part of speech tagging or word segmentation or things like that. So one of the systems that that I actually worked on with David Burke was called Musica, and that was a multi-year project that was part of the DARPA Communicating with Computers program. And Musica was a system that had these sort of three interfaces that you see on this slide. So you could chat with it to make changes to the musical structure, which to my knowledge is a very novel and strange way to be interacting with music. It's not something I've really seen explored elsewhere. So we had to build our own parser from the ground up for this. And you could also play the music and jam with it interactively if you had a digital controller of some sort. And so that really encompassed all four of those areas. And that sort of evolved into this other system called Cubex, which happened on the tail of the Musica project, which brought in the idea of really dealing with spatial language. Because there is spatial language in music, but it's kind of flat. You can move notes up, down, left or right, but you don't really put things on top of other things. So it's very two-dimensional. And we looked at taking the same parser principles and knowledge representation systems that we looked at, and well, can we put this in a little scenario where, and as you can see, there's a little robot, and he can pick things up. He's sort of holding a blue block right now, and he can put them in different places. So you chat with the robot to move it around and tell it what to do. And so one of the interesting things that came out of Cubex in particular is the robot really had to give more feedback about what it was doing with the music composition scenario and the human machine interaction that takes place there. People just kind of want to tell the machine what to do, and if it runs into a problem, just report it. But in this sort of environment where you're moving objects in a more spatial sort of way, the robot has to give you more feedback about what it's doing, or it just kind of zips around. And if it encounters a problem, you kind of go, wait, what happened? I don't understand. So that was something interesting that we learned with that system. And my little note that I have here on the lower left is sort of going back to Musica, really. And this is in there because I did notice that there were so-called bonus points for for adding these things. I will always take a topic if there are nebulous bonus points associated with it. I've built a lot of interactive systems that use interactions from a variety of different domains with music. So whether you're interacting with it through a traditional music-looking controller, or if you're interacting with it on the computer keyboard or clicking things on the screen. And there's been kind of a common theme that's emerged there related to trust. Now I'll explain why I'm calling that trust in just a second. So a lot of people who have used these systems will either greatly overestimate what they think the AI behind it is doing, or they'll really underestimate it. And they just have like zero respect for what's going on under the hood of this thing. That's even if I explain to them what's going on in a way that should be accessible. And to illustrate some of that, I've actually had people argue with me about what they think my system is doing when it's in the musical domain, which is pretty interesting to have somebody tell you that they think your system's doing some bizarre emergent act of genius that is actually mathematically impossible. But that's something that people have done. So something I'm interested in there, yeah, that's something that we saw a little bit with Musica when we did some user testing with it. I don't know of anything like that in domains more like Cubics, which sort of leaves me wondering, okay, is this an artifact of the creative domain that projects like Musica were sitting within, or is there something else going on there? And I am kind of leaning towards the something else, and that it's more that the creative domain amplifies that something else and makes people, I guess, more willing to state their over or under confidence about the system. Like the opinions are a bit stronger. And as for why I'm using the word trust there, if you have a system that does a task for some, let's just say we're working in the musical domain, I'm going to go perform with this system. There is a lot of trust involved in performing on a stage in front of people with something that, you know, is an algorithm. It's a bit of a black box. So there is an aspect of trust involved in that. And if you overtrust one of those systems, you will go on stage and do something that makes the system misbehave, and, you know, nothing sounds very good. And if you undertrust that system, you're not even going to use it at all. You'll just, you know, go up and perform using other pieces of equipment. So anyway, I'll kind of leave it there. And that's a topic that I'm very interested in discussing, is this sort of like weird over-under trust sort of thing. And if anybody else has observed that in other domains. So that'll be it for me. I'll hand it back to David.
So just want to add, so Donya didn't mention it, but Donya's a performer on a DARPA project with me that is a seedling program about AI ethics. So yeah, so we currently have, you know, I'm currently the PI on a seedling with a DARPA program manager who is very, very interested in being able to, in terms of decision-making, aligning machines with humans. And Donya is a key performer on that project.
I'm sorry, I forgot that. I when I was building the slide, I was sitting there thinking, like, well, I filled all the space. It feels like I'm forgetting. Yeah, I'm forgetting the project I'm working on. Sorry about that.
That's okay. As a preview of that particular DARPA program manager is sometime in the next probably month or so coming out with a full-blown DARPA program that is related to, they don't call it AI ethics for reasons I can go into later, but it's really about human decision-making in difficult circumstances and machine decision-making and cooperation between the two. So very, very relevant to this workshop. And so anyway, Donya, you give yourself credit for the work that you're doing that is trying to, as you say, you're understanding the various salient attributes.
Yeah, I'm most of the work that I've done on that project is, I guess that's more in the sort of DSL ontology area again. So Admetus is dealing with decision making and And I'm looking at how do we represent things to capture that in a very abstract, generalizable way. What properties are important in decision making, and how would a machine emulate someone else's decision making? What do we need to know about that person? Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, that's an ongoing project, and as Donia said, trying to say we actually want to be situations where humans can delegate critical decisions to machines. You have to identify what's salient for humans making these important decisions. How can you represent them computationally? So how do you design these things? So there's very much aspects of trust, also very much, ethical interactions, because again, machine has to, in the particular domains we're working in, understand it, consequences, at least to the extent of being able to effectively make decisions. So it's an ongoing project. Happy at some point to talk more about it, but Donia is as I said, a star performer on that effort. I think is David up next?
Yeah, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Secure Systems and Software Laboratory at UC Irvine. And I work with Professor Michael Franz and a group of around 10 PhD students. We do fundamental research in compilers and large-scale software analysis, automated testing, and things like that. We've had a significant increase in projects that relate to machine learning. So I'll try to give an overview where I think machine learning and security meet at the moment. I was thinking about naming this talk something like ML meets trust, or because trust was mentioned in the beginning, but then I decided against trust and for security. I'm happy that came up as a point, that there is a distinction, I think, between trust and security. I'll talk a little bit more in detail about this, but yeah, there's a bit of a spoiler here. So let me start with what I think is the current situation in trustworthy systems that we have. What we see is that finding bugs and exploiting them is actually quite a lucrative and thriving business today. So there are marketplaces online where you can buy and sell exploits for software, and for about the price of a Lamborghini, your phone, laptop, or server can likely be hacked. And all you have to do is click on a link, and the attacker gets remote access, ideally without noticing. In this case, this reaches around 500 million devices. For mobile, you pay roughly twice as much, but the potential reaches then in the billions. So why do we have this problem? Well, modern software is extremely complex. And in practice, new features, usability, and performance just have higher priority than security. So unfortunately, most programs that we use every day contain many such bugs. So traditional security research has been focusing a lot on what Andrej Karpathy, the director of AI at Tesla, calls software 1.0, or security of programs that were written by human developers. And this field sort of started out about 30 years ago with the realization that if a computer program contains a vulnerability and an adversary can provide malicious input to reach that vulnerability, then this can enable them to take full control over the behavior of the system. And for instance, if you provide inputs to this simple example program, I don't expect everybody to read through and understand, but you allocate a buffer that's 70 bytes. And if you provide more than the 17 bytes that were specified by the programmer, the program will crash, which doesn't look like much, but because programs crash all the time, right? But it turns out that if you provide slightly more interesting and the right kind of input to the system, to this program, then you can manipulate its internal state to get a very different behavior, which in this case is open a shell, right? A terminal, which is something that was not specified at all by the original program. And so large parts of security research have been devoted to the development of effective defenses and practical mitigations to avoid situations like that. And mostly the research is like focusing on forming an understanding of how vulnerabilities enable these attacks, how to detect and avoid such vulnerabilities using tooling, and how we can ensure security despite the presence of such vulnerabilities. And my research has touched on all of these aspects, but you can literally find hundreds of PhD theses that were written on that subject. So in my mind, the current situation is, it's still a huge problem in practice, but it's not all bad. At least in theory, we're now at a point where we have a pretty solid understanding about these kinds of vulnerabilities in software. And we also have a number of tools and practical mitigations at hand to address them, at least conceptually. However, attackers will always choose the weakest link in the chain, right? So many of the ongoing efforts are now focused on automation, integration, and scaling up of these defenses. There's been increasing adoption over the past few years, and hopefully that will continue. But new software is written every day, and the more widespread these methods are rolled out, the bigger the impact is going to be. The theory we've developed on memory and type safety has also led to new kinds of systems that are inherently memory safe. Programming languages like Rust or hardware security primitives like Cherry are a good example of that. And I think there are exciting prospects for upcoming systems. And lastly, machine learning is also, of course, becoming part of the mix to support automation and scale up and extend the scope of the existing defenses. For instance, we recently published a paper on leveraging transformers popularized in the NLP space to tackle a binary analysis task. And we're currently working on a reinforcement learning technique to make dynamic testing more efficient. And many other groups in this field are working on similar things. So this sort of brings us to this new frontier in security of software 2.0, if you will, or learning systems. And what really kind of concerns me is that when we try to make use of the tools and the methods, that the theory also that we've developed to soundly reason about traditional software and bring them to bear on these new systems, we find that there's a huge gap in practice. The Orange Book, which was published by the DoD in 1983, was one of the first attempts in computer security to codify what a secure system could look like. And it took more than 30 years to get from an idea and a vision to tools and methods that can practically and principally reason about these non-functional aspects of a system. But learning systems differ from these traditional systems in two major respects. So first, I think the roles of the inputs and outputs are reversed. So the program that we want to trust is now actually a result of the training process, whereas before it was handed in by a human developer. And second, the dominating paradigm, deep learning, produces programs that are both several orders of magnitude larger than human software, while also being highly non-modular at the same time. And so while we can reason about traditional software in a mechanistic way, deep learning really steps away from that completely to embrace a fundamentally statistical approach. And we're essentially still asking the same question, but unfortunately, we realized that our methods don't transfer to this new setting at all. That question was what an adversary could do to the internal state of the program, given the ability to provide malicious inputs. And a neural network is a large fine-tuned monolith that depends both on its internal structure as well as the training data. And there are literally millions of individual weights that could all have contributed in some complicated way. So how do we verify that the system that we built adheres to the intended behavior under all possible inputs? I think that's an essential question in computer security. And the important point is sort of that we also don't know how to build these systems using traditional software to achieve the same tasks. And so we now see deep learning being deployed in safety critical applications like in the automotive sector. And we have to ask questions like, does it make sense to try and get a FIPS certification for weight matrix? I'm not sure that makes sense at the moment. So another question is, can we build mitigations such that the system doesn't break down catastrophically, even if there is a bug. So at this point, it's really difficult to trust learned programs. And the authors of this KDD paper noted this in 2016. They showed the example of a husky. So in this case, the prediction is slightly wrong. Granted, it's pretty close because huskies and wolves aren't that far apart. But to explain that, they propose to fit a simpler model in an environment around the failing sample to explain the prediction of the underlying network. And as you can see here, the surrogate model that they provide says that the original model predicted wolf because it saw snow. So we provided animal pictures and class names during training and ended up with a snow predictor. There are other methods like SHAP, which uses Shapley values from game theory to provide explanations, and the PyTorch Captain library implements several others. However, these attribution methods, as they're called, assume that you already have a failure case. And how to get to a failure case given a trained model is unfortunately not clear. Is it a property of the data or is it a property of the model architecture? And how do we get a failure case from a trained model, and what do failure cases look like under targeted attacks are essentially open questions. And I think these are important questions. And Tay was mentioned earlier, so I actually have it on the slide here, and I also linked to quite entertaining to watch Using Security keynote from 2018 by James Mickens. I highly encourage you to go check it out. He called her Darth Tay the Bigoted. And it is unfortunately a very accurate depiction. So, but I think the case of Tay essentially illustrates what can happen when you subject a learning system to targeted attacks, even when they're not super sophisticated, right? In this case, it was just a bunch of tweets. So I think it's clear that we really need a set of new tools and methods that focus on boundary exploration and can automatically determine failure cases, and also look at data sets from the perspective of an attacker. Ideally, we could use such tools to understand the failure distribution and construct confidence intervals around trained models, but also produce adversarial distributions to improve robustness and that we can sample from. And yeah, I think generative approaches look like they could be really valuable here, and there's some interesting work into that direction, but it's still very early days, and the tooling is really not very good. So right now, I think we can only say that the system works, a learning system works empirically, but we cannot make strict statements or give any assurances. And although we cannot transfer our existing methods, we can draw many lessons and analogies, I think, from building trustworthy systems in the old world. So for software 1.0, and I've listed some desiderata here. I'm sure there's many more, and I'm happy to discuss, of course.
So I have a quick question. You mentioned Shapley values from game theory.
Mm-hmm.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit? I'm just so curious.
Yeah. So I'm also not an expert on game theory, but I think the underlying idea is to essentially model the network as a collaboration between the individual neurons. And so what you do in that case is you say, if I train a network and I remove one node at random,
Yes.
what is its contribution to the output?
To the coalition.
Yes. And you do that, you repeat that process for each neuron in the network. So it's, of course, computationally super expensive.
Yes.
But you can do it. And then you get interesting results. That the PyTorch library that I mentioned implemented some of that, and they have like more efficient implementations. In practice, I think most of these methods, they require you to estimate these values. So sometimes you don't get a really numerical method of accurately solving for these values. So.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you.
I have a bit of an open question about the slide where you showed things like why is a network converging to the value where it finishes at? Do you think that's more to do with the math because we use gradient descent, or it's more to do with the type of the network?
So yeah, I think these are exactly the kinds of questions we need to ask, in my opinion. I think gradient descent is a great algorithm that works well empirically, but we may have to reconsider the formulation of just like picking any loss function that works and training it on the objective that we want and on the data that we want, and think more about like what are the site conditions that we didn't encode in the objective function, right? Because right now I see very little work in that direction where people say like, how can we encode things like bias or fairness in that function, like mathematically, because fundamentally that's what we use to train the resulting model. And it's sort of surprising that it doesn't appear anywhere in the cost functions, right? So, but that's just, it's just one hunch. I do think that there is other interesting aspects, like can you statically analyze a network, for instance? Can you modularize a transformer network into like the encoder part? Can you modularize that part and statically like make assurances just based on the structure of the network? That's super interesting to me. I'd like to see that investigated. Unfortunately, I don't see many papers in that area.
Okay, well, thank you so much, David. And we'll move to our next speaker, Anand.
Hello, good afternoon to those who are the East Coast, but good morning to everybody. So thank you for the opportunity. And so I'm sorry, I forgot to include my research expertise and everything in these slides, but essentially I'm more into wireless networks, security, and resource allocation, network selection, and those areas, 5G. And then I diversified into social media analytics using Twitter data mainly to model user behavior in social networks. I worked on information quality, users collaboration, when do they help other users and stuff like that, models for those. More recently, I've started looking into ethical information spread in social media. Just to give a background, so
that's good.
This is again from one of our papers. Most 70% of Americans today, they make their decisions based on social media. It could be their daily habits like health habits, career and education. Even voting in elections. They're all people rely heavily on social media. But what happens is, there's a lot of, the main goal here is we want to develop machine learning and diffusion-based models for ethical spread of information. I haven't gone to the ethical part yet. I'll just explain what we have done so far and then what I'm looking forward with our discussions in this workshop, right? Because of the strong influence, it's also possible to distort information. For example, like there was some of these references, like how elections can be manipulated by tweets. You can manipulate election results using tweets. You can have people vote either way. And there were a lot of impactful unverified messages against COVID-19, at least in the earlier stages. And then there were a lot of hate crimes that resulted due to social media messages. Now, with great power comes great responsibility. So the idea of this research is twofold. First, find out how this misuse can happen, and then both educate people who are putting this information up as well as people who are receiving this information on how, to view this, what they see. Right? So the ethics part comes in, making it ethical, not just posting things, but then considering the ethical factors associated with it. Just the value of current research, right? So as of now, just to give a background, mostly the most common model for information spreading in social media is the Daly-Kendall model, or it's called the SIR model. So what happens in this case is, what happens here is the model only takes the amount of spreaders. So they segregate social media users into people who spread information, people who consume and just arrest the information. I mean, they don't spread it anymore, and people who are ignorant of it, right? And I'm sorry. And what is missing is, what we thought was, it's not just the number of spreaders, it's how active the spreaders are. right? A simple example, 100 people tweeting 1 per hour is just 100 tweets in an hour, whereas 2 people tweeting 100 per hour is like 200 tweets. That's spreading the information a lot more. So we wanted to develop a model that sort of takes into account users' activity levels. So we developed a short-term renewal theory-based model and a long-term stochastic state space model for this, right? Just to give a quick idea of what these short-term models are. So this was like a basic stochastic differential equation, which modeled the number of tweets and the activity levels. And we came up with a simple linear formulation like this at the end of it, right? I've just cut the long story short. And then we looked at one more aspect. The topics in social media spreads when there is a discussion on a topic. So let's say I put a tweet or any message about diabetes, right? And if there is no disagreement or no counter argument against it, if everybody agrees with what I say, very quickly the topic dies down. After that, there's nothing more to say. We all agree on certain thing and we move on. What happens is the spread happens, more people get involved. If there is some level of, for lack of a better word, I'll say contradiction or something where people disagree, and then they bring in their point of view, and then some people who agreed then change their point of view and so on. This we modeled we used a Twitter sentiment analysis to model disagreement on a continuum of -1 to +1. And then we used a stochastic state space matrix, which sort of models how this contradiction increases the amount of tweets. So pretty much, there is people who could be neutral, people who could be completely opposed, completely support, or somewhere in between, and how their activity levels and their contradiction levels changes the whole equation. Okay? So then we had this 2 data, right? We had this models, and this is how finally it came. And we found that is, just a little bit depth into this e power alpha. This alpha depends on these lambda i's, and for small values of t minus t0, you can make it a linear approximation. I forgot to put a sigma here. There is this alpha itself contains a sigma term. I'm skipping the details of the math. We actually compared this model with the with data we obtained from Twitter on certain topics. So we took topics like breast cancer, and we found that the model is actually, the short-term model is very well predicting the amount of tweets on the data, right? This is the blue part is from actual Twitter, and the red line is the short-term model. But it didn't work so well for, breast cancer was more an objective topic. People didn't have too many opinions about it. It's either, they're more a fact-related or a scientific topic. But when we took topics like cryptocurrency, one is we noticed that it's just blowing up. These kind of topics just people keep talking about it a lot. And second is the short-term model didn't work so well. This is more nonlinear and more exponential in nature, right? So then we tried this. I couldn't show the results here, but we tried it for other topics like, elections, immigration policies, where people can have varied opinion, and there the long-term model worked very well. And then we looked at more specific, like scientific topics, like, we just looked at algorithms and data structures, for example. And there the short-term model worked better because it was more linear, and, the amount of disagreements were lesser. But what we wanted to do was extend this work, right? So the extent is, how do we use this to control misinformation and disinformation? Like, how does information get colored based on individual biases? We conducted more experiments, which I don't have the results right here. Is one thing we observed was when it came to spreading misinformation, people had to use subtle words, because when people use strong words, let's take elections, for example. If I use strong words against one of the candidates, it easily indicates my bias towards or for or against the candidate. However, if I'm using subtle words and then trying to, hey, so-and-so is great, but, this particular policy resulted in all these things, right? There, I'm trying to color people's opinion about a candidate, but not by using strong words, whereby I don't make an enemy out of anybody. At the same time, I'm trying to put my point across. Right? And the other thing we observed was when information is manipulated, you needed longer tweets, because with a very short sentence, it's very difficult for me to color somebody's opinion or effectively spread a misinformation. Right? I'm differentiating here between misinformation and fake information, because fake information can be very, but misinformation, mainly we started this as an experiment towards, vaccines, for example. Different people have different opinion, and I personally, I have no opinion for or against. I'm just following the guideline which my physician recommends to me, right? At the same time, I respect everybody's thought on it, whatever they want to do in terms of what they want for themselves. However, a lot of information has been going on where people have been too strongly for or against it. And we found that information to be colored requires a longer description, and that's something I found from earlier research too, that deceptive or manipulative texts are usually longer. Short text is very difficult to be deceptive. People try to, So now the goal of, what I'm currently working on is, can we make use of the right words with the right frequency in the right places to actually both create good bias and go against, wrong bias? So, for example, if things get heated up, when there is some political tension going on, we don't want strong words going out so that people don't get agitated. We want to keep things under control. So there we may use bias with a good intention of saying, let's not get carried away by what we read or something like that. On the other hand, there could be, a malicious person could actually intentionally. So how do we identify these things? So for that, one of the things I like from, I picked up actually when I was reading David's paper on the Ethodian ethics is, ethics was what was mentioned was ethics is if it's supporting a group versus supporting an individual. So my thought is using coalitional game theory, where you have games where people are played by individuals, but then you also create a group utility or something, a community utility. And then you try to sort of, at the same time, if only the group is gaining and as an individual I'm losing, I'm looking to get out of the group. So there is some level of, a sort of a threshold. That's what I'm working on right now. I really don't have any more depth on the model to share more, but that's something I'm considering based on. And thank you for the opportunity in this workshop. What I'm trying to look is this. Can I look at, so far ethics, is there a quantitative way to even put some number to ethics? At this point, I'm thinking of some number between 0 and 1 or -1 and 1, whatever, and, put some continuous value. But then what does it mean? So in different contexts, some things could be ethical, something could be unethical. Right? How do we even model individual and group benefit? What is it really a benefit? For example, right now the governor of the state has taken away the mask mandate starting from, let's say, a couple of weeks. Is this an individual benefit or a group benefit? I don't know, because I could be limited by my personal opinions on it. I'm concerned for my son who goes to high school, but I'm also okay if he feels, hey, I don't want this thing covering my nose all day. Again, I don't know. I'm not even a medical expert to comment on, is that a good or a bad thing, right? So how do I model, is this, from an ethical standpoint, is this correct or wrong? I don't know, to be honest, right? So that's what I'm looking forward for these discussions. I see a lot of experts in the machine learning area and the security area and human-computer interaction area. And thank you for having me here and allowing me to share my work.
So that was great. And you mentioned you're starting to think about how to model the tension between group concerns and individual concerns. But that's just something you're starting to think about at this point.
Yep. Actually, I've been working on different other areas. Based on some of the discussions, I've been working on modeling trust based on those parameters you mentioned, the reputation, the experience, and then vulnerability. So I used that in a different context, and I used it in a wireless context where people connect to different networks, not based on trust as in security trust, but based on their experience. I connect to T-Mobile, I'm not happy with it, or they promised me a good Netflix connection, I'm just not happy, or some things like that. But then to bring it in this case would be more interesting, because now it really comes to having machines and humans interact.
Yeah. Okay. Very, very nice.
Our next lightning talk is by Louise Giovannini. I hope I said that right. Louise, feel free to jump in and say something if you want before I start your video.
Okay, no, it's fine. Yeah, you said it right. Louise Giovannini. It's complicated, so no problem. Hello, everyone. My name is Luis. I have been working as a postdoc at the University of Florida over the last 2 years, and I've been working mostly with machine learning for applications in the cybersecurity field. And before joining the UF, I was an assistant professor in Brazil, and I used to work with machine learning as well, but for applications in the biomedical field. So I'd like to start this presentation with a disclaimer. I'm probably bringing more questions than answers to this workshop. I'm sorry about that, but I think that's fine. I think that's why we are here to discuss this crazy but very important ideas related to the loyalty in machine learning AI solutions that we are developing and that will be developed in the near future. And I understand that the main question that we are focusing on this workshop is that one that I put in this slide, how we can make sure that these AI solutions, they are loyal, that they are acting on the user's best interest and not in someone else's best interest, for example. But I'd like to bring up a second question for us to think about that's very close to the first questions, the way I see it at least, which is, okay, how can we make sure, or how can we help people to perceive or to see the solutions that we are developing as being loyal, as acting on their best interest? This concerns me a little bit because, okay, we might come up with a bunch of metrics to measure how loyal the system is, but if we are not able to get people trusting that the system is actually reliable and actually loyal, it might be hard for us, or a challenge for us, to translate the solutions that we are developing into practice. So let me discuss a little bit more about it in the next slides. Okay, so before I start, let me give you some background. The first time I came across with this AI loyalty situation issue was during my PhD, and I want to share this story with you to make my point. So for my PhD, I was trying to handle the problem of falls in the elderly population, because this is a very important thing to look into. It's a major cause of death among this population. It also causes a lot of expenses and suffering for these people as well. So my main goal during this project was to detect whether older adults were at a low or a high risk of falling in the next, let's say, 6 months. Okay, but why is this important? I think this is relatively easy to answer this question. If we get to know that an older adult has an increased risk of falling the next year, let's say, well, we can take a lot of measures to try to prevent this from happening. For example, we can have this person undergoing some rehabilitation protocols, or taking certain medicines, or even adjusting their households, or buying specific types of shoes or clothing, for example. We have a lot of measures that fall into this preventive care umbrella. So that's how doctors have been identifying older adults under high risk of falling. There is a test for this identification, which is called Balance Evaluation System Test, also known as BEST test, and it's very common in the clinical setting. And well, doctors usually have the patient doing a series of exercises, for example, stretching their arms, stretching their legs, and actually not only doctors, but it involves a whole staff of healthcare workers. They are measuring how long does the patient take to do those movements, and how well is the patient performing the exercises. And based on the results, the doctor is able to compute a score that says how likely, based on a threshold that they have, how likely is this person to fall in the next year, let's say. There are a few limitations about this procedure. It is expensive because there is a lot of healthcare workers involved. It is somewhat risky to the patients because they need to perform a series of exercises, and it's time consuming as well because it usually takes several minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes to get this procedure done. So there are some limitations about it. So I'd like to briefly talk about my contribution for my PhD project. So what I did was the following. I developed a machine learning model to predict whether or not a given older subject had high risk of falling or low risk of falling, but not based on that score that I mentioned in the previous slide. Instead, based on a signal that's easier to collect. So basically, we can just put the patient on a device called Force Platform, and this device is going to record the oscillations of the body of the person. And of course, when we get old, we tend to oscillate more, which means that we are not very good at maintaining balance safely anymore. And we can capture this information through the signal. So that's the signal that I use as an input for the machine learning model. And I was able to predict risk of falling with 90% of accuracy, which is an interesting result. And this solution has some advantages. For example, it's less costly than the other approaches, is relatively easier for both patients and the healthcare workers. It takes only 1 minute to collect this data, and it's also less risky for the patients as well. They just need to be here on this device and stay here for 1 minute and just stand as still as possible, so it's relatively safe. I then decided to talk to a group of doctors, and well, they told me something that surprised me a little bit. And I'm gonna quote what they told me. One of the doctors told me, yeah, this solution looks great. I mean, it's interesting for patients and for doctors as well. But first question, how can I make sure that my patients will trust what this machine learning model says, based on this weird signal that they have no clue what it means, that they know nothing about it? So my patients are not gonna buy it. It's gonna be hard. And another doctor told me, Luis, preventive care is very challenging in this country, Brazil, because the patients usually think that doctors, we are trying to make money out of them by asking them to buy useless things, because they think that we are somehow connected to the manufacturer of those products. So they think they are making some money out of these recommendations, and they will probably not follow my recommendations unless I'm able to provide them with some concrete information, which happens in this case. Even though we have, of course, it is expensive, it is not easy to do, it's somewhat boring for the patients, but they can feel that, well, I'm not doing this exercise very well, it's taking a while, I feel that I'm rusty, I think that things are not going well. So the patient trusts more this information when it's based on this physical test, this procedure. It's more compared to blood work, for example, when you have the score and you have the threshold and you can compare things. So it's somewhat comparable to the situation here, when you have the person doing the exercise and feeling the result. It is different from the situation where you have only this picture collected from a single minute, and then based on a machine learning model, a magic model, the model is going to tell the patient, well, you have high risk of falling, so that you have to do this, and that. It's going to be very hard for these people to understand what this means, and they will probably not follow doctor's advice. All right, so how can we potentially handle this particular scenario? That's a conversation that I had with this group of doctors, and we discussed that maybe white box machine learning models would be the best solution, because we can have a better understanding of the features, what features are more relevant to the process, and we can also try to use these features as clinical indicators and have thresholds for these features that the doctor can use to discuss with the patients about their conditions, something more similar to a blood work, for example. So I have an example in the screen. Let's say that we have this signal, this oscillation of someone in this device, the Force Platform, and we could try to establish, for example, a safety circle. Let's say that this is the safety circle, and if the trajectories are all within the circle, this means that the patient is fine, is not likely to fall in the near future. However, in this case, given that we have part of the trajectories outside of the circle, this means that the patient is not safe, the patient is not able to maintain balance safely, and they are likely to fall. So that's more concrete evidence. That's a better way to present this result to the patient, and to make sure that the patient will trust what this model is saying. So it's important to provide these kind of evidence to the patient, especially when you're talking about preventive care. So my conclusion here is that, of course, it is definitely important to find ways to measure how loyal these artificial intelligence solutions are. But we also need to think about, okay, how can we explain this to the general population? Maybe these metrics, they are useful for computer scientists, but what about other groups of people? Depending on the context, we might need to come up with different, more concrete and easier to understand evidence. So I think that we, the technical experts, we need to understand the particularities of each context and take this into account while designing the solutions. Also, this requires collaborative work with people with different backgrounds, and we need to combine the ideas. And, you know, if I'm designing something to be used in the medical setting, I need to talk to people who work in this setting and get their thoughts and opinions into account while designing these solutions. And I guess that's it. Thank you. Hi.
Hi, Luis. Actually, one of the things that, as you in your presentation talked about, well, you know, people reacted unfavorably to, or, you know, machine learning or black box. It made me think, you know, would the answer, this is just speculation, would the answer be different if you had some sort of humanoid robot giving you that response, but it had a white lab coat on, doctor's coat, so it looked like a doctor?
Exactly. That makes sense. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Rather than computer scientists. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was wondering whether you had any thoughts about how, you know, it's not even necessarily just the sort of analysis that's done, but how it's presented to.
Yeah, that makes sense. How you present it to patients. First of all, you need to convince the doctors that the machine learning model is accurate, and then it's not a magic box that's coming up with magic solutions. And after convincing the doctors, it's even harder to convince the patients. They simply don't buy it unless they see something that looks familiar to them. And yeah, when you put a face or when you put the code, the white code, it makes more familiar. I do agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, that was a really good talk.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So I guess that we were right on time for, it sounds like a collaborative talk. Natasha and Sean.
Thank you. I'm going to be presenting on the behalf of both of us. Hi, I'm Natasha Banerjee, presenting our work from the TARS studio on behalf of myself and Dr. Sean Banerjee. We're both in the Department of Computer Science at Clarkson University, and I'm going to be talking about our work in AI-driven as-needed assistance in the workforce. As you can see, our website below, tars.clarkson.edu, feel free to visit it. At the studio, I perform research on computer vision, computer graphics, and computational fabrication. And Sean performs work on natural language processing, human-computer interaction, and software engineering. And our work intersects at machine learning. We also do work in robotics and virtual reality. So our work revolves around the gazebo, which is a dense multimodal sensing space to understand multi-person interactions for human-aware AI. The space is nearly 25 feet in diameter, and currently it has 192 high-speed color cameras, 16 Azure Kinect RGBD sensors, 12 thermal cameras, and 16 surface EMG sensors. These sensors, as you can see in the stretch out of the panorama up on the top, they are arranged in a cylindrical fashion around the space. The space also has several computers with 50 GPUs and a petabyte of storage to enable deep learning research with the dense multimodal data that we collect in the space. And it's funded through multiple NSF awards. Additionally, we also have a smaller space called the Cube, which we have designed to understand two-person handover interactions for human-robot collaboration. The space is 6 feet in size. It has 4 high-speed color cameras, 4 Azure Kinect depth sensors, and 5 thermal cameras. And we are in this space, we're studying how people hand objects to each other to inform natural handover to assistive robots. So here's a sampling of our current projects. We have the handover project that I mentioned that takes place in the cube, where we're collecting thermal and depth data on people performing handovers. And we are also studying how humans perform lifting operations, particularly with the goal of creating robots that help people in environments involving lifting, such as warehousing or manufacturing. And this is the bulk of our work in person-aware human-robot interaction. We have 9 PhD students at the current time at our lab, and 5 master's students. 3 PhD and 2 master's students were involved in the project on AI-driven assistance for lift. And we also have a host of undergraduate students that work with us every semester. So our work in AI-driven assistance addresses the issue of injuries in blue-collar environments. Musculoskeletal injuries are fairly common with individuals, with blue-collar workers in warehousing and manufacturing. In 2019, about 10% of all non-fatal occupational injuries were classified as overexertion due to lifting or lowering. Because of injury, workers were reported being out of work for a median of 13 days. And it turns out that injuries can impact access to, for example, women and older individuals in the workforce. They are more likely to report lower back pain and be impacted in the reduction of their working span and in access due to lost time from work. So our goal is to provide robots that collaborate with humans during lifting operations. As you can see on the left-hand side, we have the robot from Boston Dynamics that's performing a lift operation with cartons that you would find typically in a warehouse environment. But as you can see, it is operating largely by itself. And currently, much robot-driven lift targets the questions of how to, for example, perform control while the robots are performing lift. And with the introduction of automation that is self-driven, a fear of workplace automation is being reported. Several studies are demonstrating that people who have lower education or are in blue and white collar jobs in manufacturing and warehousing end up reporting a fear of their jobs being displaced by robotic technology. The fear is also highest in underrepresented populations, for instance, females or individuals of color, which is why the introduction of robots in the workplace in the workforce has to be approached with care, with consideration for the people whose jobs would be displaced without a proper place for the robot's interaction in the environment. So our idea is that robots should assist in blue-collar environments only when needed, only on an as-needed basis. And in doing so, we take inspiration from human collaboration in everyday tasks. For example, for large objects, for large packages, multiple people have to collaborate with each other in order to lift the package. And collaboration could be in multiple forms. For example, a person might want simultaneous assistance from another coworker, from another assistant, or the person might not need assistance and might attempt to perform the lift by themselves, or the person might say that I am fatigued, so I do want you to take over and perform the lift. But our hypothesis is that robotic assistants are more likely to be trusted and accepted in the workforce if, in general, they preserve worker safety and respect worker independence. They act while understanding the needs of the workers, whether they want assistance, and if they do want assistance, then in what form do they want it? Do they want it where it's full intervention or whether it is simultaneous assistance? This work is funded by the NSF Future of Work at the Human Technology Frontier, or the FWHTF. This is one of 2 FWHTF grants that Sean and I are collaborators on at Clarkson. And the FWHTF solicitation is part of NSF's 10 Big Ideas. So it's part of NSF's mission to understand the place of technology in blue-collar environments, and to make sure that we're creating technology that can be trusted. So to get a fine-grained understanding of lifting operations in warehousing and manufacturing environments or transportation and delivery, we are doing a multimodal analysis of lift at our gazebo, where we're collecting dense multimodal data as 24 subjects lift cartons in 4 weight classes. When we collected the data, we had subjects come in on 2 separate days, on a blind day when they were not provided the knowledge of the weight they were lifting, and on a non-blind day where they were provided this knowledge prior to the lift. Now, the blind day especially represents the case where people would encounter in a warehouse, as they might not have access to the weight that they are lifting, and they perform lift with a number of different objects, probably because it's not written on the side of the carton, or even if it is, it can sometimes be erroneous. The subjects were also asked to rate their strenuousness of lift on a scale of 1 to 5. And on the blind day, they were asked to examine the cartons and provide a pre-guess of weight before lift and a post-guess after lift. The demographic data that we collected included height, age, weight, and fitness routine of the individuals. So here are example videos of the 4 weight classes that we captured. We had subjects pick up 0-pound weights, 15-pound weights, 30-pound weights, and 45-pound weights. And as you go higher and higher in weight, the subjects tend to struggle with the carton, and so the duration of the lift is increased. So, for example, in the 45-pound lift, the person performs a more controlled lift as opposed to 0 pounds where they perform it rapidly. We also see a difference between the way the subjects perform the lift on the non-blind day, but when they had access to the weight knowledge, they were able to be more controlled in their lift. Whereas on the blind day, when they did not get the weight knowledge beforehand, the initial attempt at lift takes them by surprise, and then over time they adjust their posture as they come to recognize the weight. We collected video data from 4 modalities and 3 viewpoints to have a dense understanding of lift. So we have cameras facing the left-hand side, right-hand side, and front side of the subject. And we collected data from 3 high-speed cameras at 70 frames a second, and then color and depth data from the Azure Connects at 30 frames a second, and thermal data, once again, at 30 frames a second from our Sierra Viento G thermal cameras. So we used the data that we collected to see if we could create AI algorithms, basically convolutional neural networks that can detect weight and strenuousness as the person performs the lift. So what you see on the left is a detection of the joints of the subject using open pose as they interact with the object. And we found that if you were to track the movement of the joints over time, for example, the hip joint, the knee, the wrist, and the torso, for lower weights, the movement upward is faster, whereas for higher weights, it takes a while as the person is struggling to make the lift. So using this information, we were able to design networks that could predict binary weight classification, whether it is below 15 pounds, at or below 15 pounds and above 15 pounds. We predicted that with 81% accuracy. And we were able to predict the strenuousness on a binary scale. So if it was a strenuousness of 1 or 2, then it fell in one class, and if it was 3 or higher, it fell in another class. We were able to predict that just from joints at a 77% accuracy with classifiers that did not have access to the identity of the user. Simultaneously, in order to understand how people in blue-collar environments perceive the place of robotics, especially for lifting operations, we're performing an ongoing survey where we're sampling blue-collar workers and managers from industries in retail, the automotive sector, warehousing, and transportation. The companies that we are sampling are spread across North America, Europe, and Australia. And we are asking questions on access and inclusivity, preferred forms of human-robot collaboration. For example, whether people want assistance from human coworkers, and when they do ask for assistance, what form of assistance do they seek? And then if there were to be robotic helpers in the workforce, then what form of assistance would humans prefer to seek from robotic helpers? Would they like them to intervene all the time, or would they like them to intervene only on an as-needed basis, and how? We're also asking questions on whether people have privacy issues with the data recorded by robotic helpers. So our continued work is looking at seeing if we could perform AI-driven assistance from data where we abstract out privacy-revealing attributes. So for example, do not have video data, just have thermal data, as you can see in the center, or just have 3D skeletal data, as you can see on the left. Where if we were to exclude the data that you can see on the right, we do not have issues with privacy. And then to engage workers in actual experiments with the AI that we develop, to study how they perceive robotic trust when looked at from the perspectives of safety, privacy, and independence in the workforce. So that is the end of my talk, and I'm happy to address any questions that people may have over email.
That was a really very interesting talk. Thank you. All right, well, I'm going to move to the next talk is Mauli. You want to introduce yourself? And
all right, so thanks. I'm happy to be here. And I recently joined Galva. I think this is my second week at Galva. Moved from academia to industry. And my research is broadly in the areas of AI, ML, edge computing. And today I plan to talk about some work we did, some in the past, some more recently on NLP. And we never thought about the ethics issue, but because of this workshop, the last few days we've been discussing with my collaborators and trying to come up with, okay, what are some of the ethics issues? Because we felt proud about our publications and so on. But now thinking back, I think there are some serious concerns that we need to address, and I hope to take the next 10 minutes to talk about some of these issues that we never even thought about before. All right, so as I said, I'm a principal scientist. Today I'm going to talk about natural language processing, NLP, AI, NLP, and some of the ethical issues that could come as a result of some of the NLP research and technologies. So the first case study that I want to present, we did this, as you can see the date, sometime in 2011, long time ago. We were interested in identifying the gender of an author. You receive an email with a certain name. Maybe the name has it's a male sounding name, but is really a male, right? So the motivation for this was we want to identify phishing emails and scam emails and so on. So we said, okay, is it possible to identify author gender from emails and blogs and so on? So we developed a very, what we thought at the time was a cool technology using, before deep learning, right? We used some interesting other ideas and then use open source data, right? Like the Enron email data set and so on. And then we were able to show that NLP, using our algorithms, we could identify the author gender with maybe 50 words, right? With about anywhere from 85 to 95% accuracy. Okay, and so it received quite a bit of press coverage. And in fact, I'm showing here one from New Scientist. They tried our tool on a few data that they had, and we were able to identify the author gender fairly accurately, right? And one of the things they did was they used this technology to analyze a blogger, right? There was a blogger who was writing a blog about how the Syrian government was bombing them and so on and so forth, and supposed to be a gay girl living in Damascus. So a lot of these CNN and all, right, they didn't have boots on the ground, so they used to go to this blog and then just verbatim report that in the news article. Then when the New Scientist, they took a tool and ran the blog through our tool, they found that this person who was, the blogger's name was Amina, right, a female name, was really not a woman at all, right? It was a 40-year-old American, Tom McMaster, living in Edinburgh, and confessed that he's been writing fake blogs, right? He was just sitting in his on his couch and then just making up things every day. So we were able to identify fake blogs, and as a result, other things happen. But the issue is, right? Even though we talked about gender identification from text, but sex and gender are completely two different things, correct? In fact, this is from the 2018 an article in Nature. So the US is proposing to define gender based on the human anatomy, and basically this article argues that that has no basis in science, correct? Because sex and gender are two different things. Sex is something, right, based on the physical characteristics, whereas gender is much more complex than that. It's just it's a social construct, as I talk about, right? It's how people think about themselves. So it has nothing to do with the physicality of a person. Okay, so just using NLP to identify author gender, even in 2011 we weren't really aware of these issues, but thinking about it now, it sort of puts our research in a completely new light. The second case study that I want to present is we've been working on AI for mental health. Especially our goal was to identify very early stage dementia, very early stage Alzheimer's disease from speech. So if you're on a phone call, you're talking to people, we wanted to identify, well, is it possible that if you're beginning to show some very, very early stages of dementia or Alzheimer's, is there any difference in the speech pattern, the language pattern? Are there any linguistic biomarkers? So we started looking at this. We looked at NLP and deep learning and so on. We were able to identify, develop algorithms that could detect dementia and very early stage Alzheimer's to fairly in a good degree. Again, it received some press coverage as well. And then we got really curious because of, President Ronald Reagan was, at least they announced in 1994 that he had Alzheimer's. So, but the question to us was, did they find out in 94 or 93, around the time that he had Alzheimer's, or did he show very, very early stages of Alzheimer much before 1994? Okay, so we looked at his speeches over a 10-year period, and then we did some analysis, linguistic analysis, NLP, and also anomaly detection and so on, right? And then what we found was the speeches from 1994 to 1996, he is beginning to show linguistic biomarkers that are abnormal compared to his other speeches. So this led us to believe that he started developing early stage Alzheimer's somewhere between 1984 and 1986, not in 1994 when it was publicly announced, right? And then our algorithmic analysis, data analysis, was also corroborated by some other research in psychology and linguistics. We also looked at the same issue in low resource language like Urdu, correct? So there's a lot of, quite a bit of data available for the English language. You can go to Reddit and collect data about people being depressed, right, and having other mental health issues. But whereas in other languages, non-English languages like Urdu, which is a low resource language, there's hardly any data. So I had a student from Pakistan, who was a Fulbright scholar. So I worked with her. And our goal in this research was to identify, from Urdu, are people showing early depression, right? Are they in a depressed state of mind, or are they happy or not depressed? So again, we had some good results, like about 85 to 90% accuracy. And the third use case I want to talk about is, so we did this research for one of the world's largest organizations, management consulting companies. Their goal was to identify, to monitor communications, it's voice communications and text and chat communications, social media communications of their employees, because it's a financial institution. The US regulation allowed them to collect all this type of data, and they were collecting this type of data. So the research question for us was, is it possible to identify high-risk individuals within the company who may indulge in illegal activity? An example, let's say there's a financial trader in this company, and they lost maybe a $2 million bet, right? A high-risk trade they did, which means they want to recoup the money in the next, let's say, a week, right? So they could start, perhaps they could indulge in insider trading, collusion, and so on. So the question to us was, is it possible to, when they monitor all their communications data, can we identify that these are high-risk individuals showing behavior that is abnormal, right, with respect to that individual based on their historical data? So we were able to, so we used ideas from NLP and information theory. We also came up with a new ranking algorithm. So for example, there could be, this specific company had 50,000 employees globally. So we cannot really, so the question to us was, they wanted to know, show me the top 100 people out of this 50,000 people that are high risk employees, showing behavioral analysis, behavior that's high risk. So we had to now develop a ranking algorithm. So for example, you may have two people that may show like an emotional pattern, maybe they're angry and upset and so on, that's comparable, but is it possible to compare them and say, well, this person is higher risk than other person, right? So we were looking at a 12-dimensional scale. We were looking at their emotions, not just sentiment, just their emotions. Are they angry? Are they sad? They're upset? They're happy, and so on. So we had to come up with a new way of ranking people based on the emotions that we're extracting. So we were able to actually successfully do that. And this has been integrated into a surveillance product that this company uses, for their human resources group, okay? And then they have several layers there. So they say, okay, based on the risk assessment that we put out, then they have their own business matrix. Then they would decide, should we report this person, this employee, to their manager or to the HR or to legal, right? So it gets escalated based on the risk metric that we put out. So these are the three different use cases, case studies that we have worked on, NLP, machine learning, right, and so on. Everything has to do with, of course, the mental health and the social behavior. Now, as I said, we never thought about some of the ethical questions around this. And so, I'd like to now talk about those questions today. So the first case study, we were trying to identify author gender from text. Our goal was to identify online scammers, but this poses a huge risk to the LGBT community, right? Because they do not identify themselves either as a man or a woman. So their privacy is at risk. And maybe online, if our tool is being used to identify LGBT communities, then they could get bullied and there could be some other repercussions. So that is an ethical question that we have to be cognizant of. The second question is the implications of analyzing the US president's or even any politician's mental health, which is the case study too, right? We live in a politically polarized world. So let's say this tool is used on President Biden and it says that President Biden is mentally unwell, right? Or something like that. The implications are huge, correct? They could lead to social unrest, could be economic impact. They could also be stereotyping. Right? We say, oh, the age and poor mental health are correlated. So that is also an ethical question. So we want to be very careful about how these tools are used and how the outputs of these tools are interpreted. So that needs to be that's an ethics question that we have to dig deep into. There is also other things. I talked about mental health from Urdu, right, or other low resource language, or countries where mental health practitioners aren't that many. So if this tool is used on that population and a tool says there's someone is suicidal or depression, many countries, including the US, social and mental health is a social stigma, right? There's a social stigma attached to it. That could cause social isolation. So again, we have to be very careful about how these tools are used and how the outcomes are interpreted. It's also likely that our medical insurance companies may say, just like you do an annual blood test, they look at your health, right? Do you have high blood pressure? How's your heart, and so on. The insurance company may say, we want you to put through this tool like 24/7, okay? And then if it identifies that you're showing some signs of mental health issue, they may increase your health insurance cost. So that is also an issue that we have to look into. And the third case study, which is the behavioral HR, human resources analytics, is can an employee be fired if this tool says that this employee on the company has been angry for the last 1 week, has been highly upset for the last 1 week? Then can the HR use this as a reason to fire them? In fact, I did Google search just before this talk. It looks like in the US, people can be fired for mental health issues. Mm-hmm. Okay, just that companies will not tell them that they're being fired for mental health, but they'll give some other reason. Okay, so that is an ethical question that we need to we need to address. Again, will the employer start and increase the surveillance of employees that are found to be at high risk? Could it lead to decreased employability, exposure to lawsuits? And what are some of the regulatory implications? Just like here, right, the US law states that people can be fired for mental health issue. So we need to figure out, as technology is advancing, AI, ML especially, what are the regulatory implications of tools like this on US as well as global regulations? So that's my 10-minute talk. I'll be happy to take questions, as I said, but I have to drop off, unfortunately, for the meeting. But I look forward to your feedback and questions. Mauli@galva.com is my email address. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be here today, and my name is Liwei Zhang. I am a third-year PhD student working with Professor Yejing Choi at University of Washington. And today I'm going to talk about our work on Delphi towards machine ethics and norms. And this is a joint work with many amazing collaborators from both UW and AI2. Neural models become more prevalent than ever nowadays. And we use AI systems to screen resume, to take care of patients, to drive autonomous vehicles, and even to authorize loans. And this impending widespread deployment of neural models require machine ethics, meaning developing ethically behaving machines that honor human values and benefit society. And at the heart of the problem is that the models are required to tell between what's right and wrong in the face of everyday situations. However, this is challenging because moral judgment varies with changing grounds. For example, killing a bear is wrong, but with different contextualizations, the action may become justifiable. While this is almost trivial for humans to reason about, even the most powerful modern neural language models are quite ignorant in this regard. For example, if you ask GPT-3 whether it's okay to explode a nuclear bomb to save a child, it would say something as horrific as, "Why not? Go ahead." And computational judgment of what's right or wrong in real-life scenarios is challenging, mainly because moral judgments are usually governed by the interplay between competing cultural, social, ethical norms and their grounding context. And applying top-down moral rules to everyday situation is not feasible, considering the complexity of real-life scenarios and nuances between competing values. And instead, we approach this problem from bottom up by crowdsourcing people's descriptive judgments on grounded situations. And this is also inspired by John Rawls, one of the most prominent American philosophers in the 20th century, who proposed the crowdsourced morality in his paper Outline of a Decision Procedure of Ethics back to 1951. And following this idea, we introduced Delphi, Commons' moral models for learning human values, norms, and ethics. To empower Delphi with knowledge of human ethics, we introduced Commons' Norm Bank, a large-scale, high-quality knowledge repository of people's ethical judgment on diverse everyday situations. Commons' Norm Bank has 1.7 million examples of descriptive ethics instances, and it is sourced from 5 existing datasets. Most of them were developed by previous works of our own group, including social chemistry, which is the major source for Norm Bank, and the social bias frame, which emphasizes on the social justice perspective of human ethics. And Delphi operates through 3 types of question answering mode. Freeform QA takes in an everyday situation and outputs a simple moral judgment. Yes/no QA takes in a statement of moral judgment, and the model either agrees or disagrees with the input. And finally, relative QA takes in pair of inputs and compare their relative moral acceptability. And we combine the power of both high-quality symbolic knowledge of human ethics from Commons' Norm Bank and the excellent extrapolation ability of pre-trained language models to empower Delphi to computationally make moral reasoning. And here's the results comparing Delphi with baseline GPT-3 models. Delphi outperforms all baselines, including the GPT-3 Da Vinci model with extensive prompt engineering. By the way, this model has 175 billion parameters, and Delphi has 11 billion. This shows that off-the-shelf neural language models, despite being impressive in many tests, lack of a sense of human ethics without being taught explicitly with human moral knowledge. And let's look at some examples of Delphi. Delphi is not only able to reason about conventional acts that are usually have obvious moral implications, for example, skipping work versus skipping work when you're sick. It's able to reason about unconventional acts as well. For example, cleaning toilet bowl with a wedding dress is considered somewhat disgusting. And in addition, the Delphi is sensitive to some cultural conventions. For example, wearing a white versus bright orange shirts to a funeral. It also knows about Commons' life know-hows, like drinking milk versus soy milk if I'm lactose intolerant. And moreover, it's even aware of some Commons' scientific knowledge, such as it's dangerous to mix bleach with ammonia. And among all facilities of Delphi, the most surprising one is that it's highly robust against compositional situations. For example, mowing the lawn is expected, but if you do it late at night, that it's rude because it's noisy. However, if you live in the middle of nowhere, then that's okay because no one would be bothered by the noise. Another important aspect of human ethics is social justice. And Delphi demonstrates some awareness of equity and inclusion implications, as shown in these examples. And in order to more systematically understand to what degree Delphi is capable of making fair and just moral reasoning, we conducted a quantitative study to probe into potential societal and demographic biases in Delphi. We used the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations to prompt Delphi, and Delphi's outputs are deemed just and fair 98% of the time in this experiment. However, when it comes to social biases, even 1% of gap might propagate harms to marginalized and minority groups. So it's our responsibility as researchers to continue pushing the limit of making models more fair and equitable. And finally, despite Delphi being impressive in many regards, it is not without limitations. And we also conduct extensive qualitative analysis on the limitations of the current model and discover that it tends to be inconsistent with numbers, unfamiliar topics, and certain cultural customs and unlawful acts. And we aim to incorporate these insights into new iterations of Delphi to continuously making progress in more reliable and trustworthy machine ethics. And I also want to mention that we also have this demo to demonstrate the promises and the limitations of the research prototype. And if you haven't got a chance to play with it, please take a few minutes to do so when you need a break. And yeah, it's pretty fun. And because we do have more time for today's talk, I'd like to share some new insights since our initial release of the Delphi paper. First, the scale of Commons' NOR bank matters for Delphi's performance. Delphi learns very fast with even 1% of all training data. But to achieve better performance, the more data, the better. And second, quantity alone is not enough to maximize Delphi's learning of complex situations. The compositionality of data matters even more. And here, the base model is trained on non-compositional simplistic situations only. And although they are about 7% of all training data, the model performs even worse than Delphi trained on only 1% of compositional data. And third, Delphi learns from in-the-wild data. And the in-the-wild data are the adversarial situations that Delphi demo users input into the system. And the more Delphi is further learned on these new annotations of in-the-wild data, the better it does on these situations, while maintaining its original performance on the NOR bank situations. And although I showed the improvement of accuracy in the previous plots, but when it comes to ethics, accuracy is not always a good measure, as moral judgment is not always black and white. So in addition to look at the accuracy of a single output, we also analyze whether the distribution of the model's output matches the distribution of the disagreement of human judgment. And the results show that Delphi is better at capturing human disagreement comparing to baseline T5 fuchsia models. And even better, for Delphi trained on distributional in the wild data, which means the model sees diverse opinions with respect to same situations, does an even better job than Delphi that never sees in the wild situations during training. And finally, we also explored several safe use cases of Delphi. First, Delphi is able to help hate speech detection tests, especially under the fuchsia setting, where training data is limited, and under out-of-distribution setting, where we need to generalize performance to data with different distributions comparing to the training data. And the knowledge of Delphi could transfer to different moral frameworks as well. For example, instances reflecting utilitarianism, deontology, or justice. And finally, Delphi is able to help improve open text generation. For example, Delphi could guide model to generate stories with more socially acceptable contents, or to generate more socially responsible dialogues. And moving forward with machine ethics research, we mainly want to follow on these three themes. And we already started some follow-up works in each category, actually. The first one is to move beyond the North American perspective to diversify cultural and ideology representations of machine ethics. And second, to understand Delphi inside and out, to probe knowledge of Delphi and to analyze surrounding social phenomena. And finally, we want to work on interpretable and explainable machine moral reasoning to improve the transparency and accountability of machine moral reasoning. And in conclusion, our work presents an important step towards building AI systems that are ethically informed, socially aware, and culturally inclusive. And that's the end of my talk today. And thanks for listening. And welcome to any questions from now on. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so that was a wonderful talk, and of course, very, very germane to the notion of quotidian machine ethics. I was, lots of questions. I'll just start with one, which is, you talked about different, say, schools of ethical thought, utilitarianism versus some sort of, Kantian approach. Is right now the system biased in any particular way or more appropriate? Is it more of, say, a rules-based system right now as opposed to a utilitarian calculation? How would you describe its current form?
Yeah, so this is a very good question, and I actually have some examples to show for this. Yeah, so can you see this?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's actually very amazing that after we deployed Delphi, and then we received lots of queries for Delphi and see lots of different examples. And then we discovered that there's actually very rich information within this model. And we see that there's actually a difference between what Delphi knows versus what Delphi default is. For example, in this case, if you ask if you're progressive versus if you're conservative, then the opinions are different for this specific situation. And it's actually very common for Delphi. If you look at political leanings and with respect to different political issues, and just qualify it from certain perspective would give different judgment from the model. Yeah, and some other perspectives, like if you ask according to a deontologist versus according to a consequentialist, then hurting people is okay if it's an accident has different judgment as well. And even consumerist versus anti-consumerist. And this is my favorite, that they also distinguish between personal roles, that according to a restaurant manager giving out free food, you shouldn't, but according to a customer, then it's great. Yeah. So I think it's hard to say that what specific or one framework the current Delphi is, but it's a rich, and it definitely presents different positionality if we probe it differently. Yeah.
So you can probe it, you can tell it, give some, as you say, you tell it, I'm asking this question from the perspective of somebody politically liberal or conservative. So you can qualify the question with some attributes from the questioner.
Yes, that's the case. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really nice. That's very nice. Okay, so anyway, again, fascinating talk, and so unfortunately, any other quick questions? Unfortunately, in the interest of time, we have to move on, but I hope we get the chance to engage and ask further questions. That was.
Yeah, sounds great. And thank you for everyone who listened to my talk.
Sure. Okay, so I believe our next talk is Surya, if you're.
So my talk today is on the complexity reduction of machine learning models to address the carbon footprint of AI. So my research generally deals with complexity reduction. That is something which interests me a lot because modern machine learning models and neural networks, to be more specific, they are huge and they take lots of time to train and lots of dollars to train as well. So most of this work was done while I was a PhD student at USC. So yeah, let's get going. A couple of things that I would like to say to kind of set the tone of my talk is that ML models, they largely prioritize the final performance that they get. So how good are they at doing, say, one or two particular tasks? But what we often do not think about is the energy and the costs required to make the machine learning model good. Neural nets in particular take thousands of GPU hours to train. And a pretty famous paper, which came out in 2019, actually tried to quantify the carbon dioxide equivalent, which training machine learning models resulted in. And so these numbers are actually pretty scary if you look at them. So let me turn on the pen here. So training one model on a GPU, if you take the time to tune it, can actually emit more carbon than what an entire person emits in their lifetime, quite a bit more. And something called neural architecture search, which has got a lot of attention in the last maybe 3 or 4 years, which basically means that if you give me a problem, I will try to find you the best machine learning model for that problem. So that can emit as much carbon as 5 cars do in their whole lifetime. So this statistic was actually what made the paper pretty famous. So that brings us to the ethical questions, which I want to ponder about in this talk. So I have a couple of quotes here, a little bit long, but basically the first quote says, talks about environmental racism, which is that the negative effects of climate change actually impact marginalized communities first. So is it fair or is it ethical to build, let's say, even larger language models and natural language processing in English, most of it, when the price of the carbon, which is being emitted by those models, may actually be paid for by the people in, let's say, the Maldives Islands, who will be victims of climate change. This quote, by the way, the first one, actually comes from a paper where Timnit Gebru is a co-author. People here might know that name. So Gebru is a pretty leading proponent of diversity in AI. And events leading up to this paper from which this quote is taken actually led to her resigning from Google. The second set of quotes that I have is taken from the Struble paper that I presented in the previous slide, which basically talks about the high costs of training machine learning models stifling creativity. Because many researchers who have pretty good ideas actually do not have the means or the dollars to compete with other people or other groups who are far richer. So in this way, basically what we see in machine learning research is the rich get richer cycle. So some solutions to address these problems. So there have been quite a few papers which have talked about those, such as, so one main thing is quantifying and reporting the carbon emissions of machine learning models. So instead of just reporting the performance, also report how much energy, what is the CO2 equivalent that you use to get to that level of performance. Choosing the hardware is pretty important. So all of this kind of brings me to my work, which is on the general complexity of machine learning and neural net models. So what I'm showing you here is a multi-layer perceptron, and this is a convolutional neural network at the bottom. It's a pretty celebrated one. This is actually the original ResNet paper. Now, this thing has about 20, 25 layers, and this is actually pretty small by modern standards, where networks can easily have 100 layers and billions of parameters, to be honest. So what all that complexity does is that it kind of feeds into this vicious cycle where more complexity means that you spend more time, more dollars, and more watt hours in trying to train those models. So all of this actually led us to ask the basic question in our research, which is that do neural networks and machine learning models need to be quite so big? So one fairly simple experiment that we conducted is to train a fully connected network, which is where every node connects to every node in the next layer. And we found that the parameters of the network, also called the weights, most of them are very close to 0 after you train. So this is the histogram of the magnitudes. So that led us to believe that maybe we don't need so many weights, and maybe we can actually go forward with simpler models for neural nets. So the thing that we came up with, it's called predefined sparsity, which is where you basically delete a whole bunch of weights in a neural network. And you do this right at the beginning. So when you're training, as well as in the final inference phase of the model, you always have this reduced model. So in this case, this is 33% dense as compared to what a fully connected model would be. Now, what does this do to performance? Because after all, that's a big question. That can you make machine learning models more simple while keeping their performance as same to the previous case as possible? Well, so there's no free lunch, right? So if you make models simpler, then you are going to lose some amount of performance. But the key thing that we found is that when we plot performance on the y-axis versus the complexity on the x-axis, these curves kind of, they look logarithmic. So what that means is that as I reduce the complexity by going like that, the reduction in performance that I get is pretty small up to a certain point. So that kind of brings me to the basic question here, which is that are we willing to pay this small amount of performance reduction if that means that the resulting neural net will be much, much lower in complexity, which means that it's quicker to train and it burns less dollars and emits less carbon while you're training the neural network. So to put this a little bit more into a real life context, think of it like this. Would you be willing to have your Google Home respond to you slightly slower because its performance is slightly lower, if that means that training that Google Home actually emitted 5 times less carbon than what the current Google Home does? So that's, yeah, so these are the kind of questions that I want to ponder about. I also want to spend a little bit of time discussing something called Deep and Cheap, which is an automated machine learning framework that we developed. Automated machine learning is basically when you have a given problem and you're trying to find the best machine learning model for that problem. So generally, the way people do that is that they search over many different machine learning models, many different neural nets. And they basically try to minimize the loss, right? And they pick the best neural net for the given problem. So what we did is we did the same thing with a twist, where we introduced this additional complexity term. So instead of just minimizing for the loss, you're also trying to minimize the complexity of the resulting models. So what that means is that this variable here, WC, that actually controls how much importance you want to give to complexity. So when that is high, then you get models at the left end of the scale, which are energy efficient, and they're also quick to train. But you do sacrifice some performance by actually training those models and deploying them. So we did some simulations, and we compared to a few other AutoML benchmarks. And we found that Deep and Cheap actually performed fairly well when you consider different levels of complexity. So what I'm showing you here, this number is the peak performance that we got, which is pretty comparable with the peak performance which some other frameworks got. This one takes 30 hours of GPU time to actually find and develop. Now, if you want to actually do that a lot quicker, well, then you can spend less time and develop a much smaller model, which is basically this one, which just has 4 layers. But of course, you're going to sacrifice some performance here, right? So there's a scale over there. But I think the big thing that I want to show in this table is that we may not really need huge neural networks for to get really good performance. And this is something which is also echoed in some other pretty popular papers. This one comes to mind by Zagoriuko, which kind of said the same thing, that we can do away with very deep nets because honestly, they take time to train, they burn so much resources. So that's a takeaway from my talk, really, that we may not really need these very big models, but it's a second one, which I think is more important, that efficient models, which basically give you good performance for every hour that you spend training it, those might be more important than models which give you slightly better performance, but which you take 1 week to develop. So yeah, that's my talk, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
I actually have a question.
Yeah.
Which is, it sounds very related to the built-in sparsity and complexity during training. It sounds very related to model compressibility, where people, like after training in a normal setting, realize that, as you said in the beginning, a lot of the weights don't actually matter, so they just strip them and throw them away, right? I was wondering if you are aware of any, I guess, techniques or like evaluations that study how this sparsity actually ends up in the final models that were trained in a normal setting.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So yes, you're absolutely right that there are quite a few papers in the literature which train a full model and then they throw away the weights before they finally use the model. So what we try to do is actually throwing away the weights one step before, meaning that we threw away the weights before we trained the model. Because like the main cost of developing a neural network comes from the training phase. So if you train the full network and then you throw away the weights, then you get some reduction in cost, but not as much as you might get if you throw away the weights in the first place. So does that answer the question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if there's anybody who had any results like that you were aware in the literature as to why that is. So why do we get effective sparsity in some of these really big models, but then when we build in sparsity, like in your approach, we sacrifice on performance? So it seems counterintuitive, right? Why would we be able to train a large model, throw away many of the weights, and don't really sacrifice on performance? And then if we build sparsity in a certain way, we have to sacrifice on performance. So there seems to be some some underlying reason for that sparsity kind of naturally occurring, right, in the models. I was just curious if there were any like tangible results, because I didn't see any, maybe, and it sounded like you were more into that kind of work.
Yeah, that's a good point. So what I will say is that what you're throwing away, it's not quite zero. So that's how I would try to answer that. That all those weights, even the smaller weights, they have some small purpose. So when you're throwing them away, you're sacrificing something. Like in general, the more you throw at a network, the more performance you get. But that kind of evens out near the end. So that's basically this part of the curve. Like if you keep on throwing more and more parameters, you will keep on getting more performance, but very slight increases. Like the rate or the slope of the curve will be fairly small.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
So what we didn't get to do on this first day so much was the actual interaction and discussion and talking about, okay, we've got researchers working on subjects that all are at least tangential to the idea of this, quotidian machine ethics or everyday ethical interactions. And so the focus for tomorrow, we'd like it to be, more on the actual building of some sort of community and honing in on some topics that we could flesh out. And so what tomorrow morning, my colleague Eric Davis is going to kick things off with a with a talk, and we're going to have the opportunity for 2 discussion periods. My bias right now is to say, as opposed to a bunch of small breakout groups, that the group as a whole is probably, compact enough that we can certainly for the first discussion period have everybody involved. And my plan is for the Galois folks to put together a something we can show tomorrow morning as here's a very, very short list of possible discussion topics, and launch into those as topics or themes that we could flesh out tomorrow morning. Again, I would like this to feel organic and to emerge from the interests and the questions of the people, here that are participating. But that is our plan. So Eric, if I remember your talk tomorrow, some scenarios to share and questions to pose.
Yeah, the goal of the talk tomorrow is to discuss some scenarios that I hope will be eye-opening. And just to troll David, I'm going to spend the entire time talking about trolley problems, but in a very non-traditional sense. Okay, very, very nice. And so, our hope is that tomorrow we'll have, now that we've gotten a chance to get introduced to each other, at least a little bit, tomorrow we'll have the chance to do some sort of engagement and conversation. Eric and I can take a couple of minutes to talk a little bit more about the particular research programs that we currently have going on in this space and discuss opportunities to push those ahead more with this group. So what I wanted to do, though, is, before we get to the top of the hour and completely wrap up, did want to open it up to, general questions, observations, criticisms, anything we could have done better, anything you would like to see during day 2 that was either absent today or that would just, bring you more engagement. So if they're, certainly love to get any feedback. And by the way, if you have some or you aren't sure, you can send something to Julie, anytime today, and we will absolutely take it into account for our planning for tomorrow. So that's my opening it up. Any comments, questions? Okay, well, I will, again, it's, a lot of material to digest, and hope to see people here tomorrow. As I said, please feel free to reach out to Julie if you have any other questions or comments. And as I said, we'll put something together for tomorrow that will hopefully evince some good conversation and some next steps to come out of this. Anything that I'm missing, Julie, that I should be?
I don't think so. I think you covered everything. There's just been a little bit of chat about sharing slides, and just want to tell everyone, if you could share your slides with me in the format and whatever slides you feel comfortable sending to everybody, then I can share them. I can share them around, but you can just send me, even if you already sent them to me, if you want to send me an updated version, whatever you want to be shared with the group, I can do that. Other than that, I think you've covered everything, David.
Okay. Yeah, I want to say I really appreciate everybody's participation. And, I thought that everybody had relevant and fascinating talks. So I, really hope we get the chance tomorrow to, for more interaction and to hear from everybody. And with that, then, I'll stick around for a few minutes, but we can then, declare, day 1 a success. And again, thank you so much for participating.